Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night, and feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. What becomes of a world when most of its waters no longer flow, no longer rise and fall, but are held in silence within ice, in a state almost motionless, enduring for tens of thousands of years, between roughly 26,000 and 20,000 years ago? The Earth entered the peak of the last glacial period, when immense sheets of ice spread like vast white shields, covering much of North America and stretching across northern Europe into Asia, forming two colossal continental ice systems, each carrying within it a quiet yet decisive role, like immense reservoirs of the planet's water. The water did not vanish, it merely changed its form, shifting from ocean to ice, from movement into stillness, from flowing currents into a slow accumulation drawn out across millennia. As water was locked away in this manner, the oceans began to retreat, not in a sudden moment, but through a long, gradual process, almost imperceptible within a human lifetime, yet powerful enough to reshape the very contours of the world. Sea levels fell by some 120 to 130 meters below those of today, and what had once lain beneath the waves slowly emerged, like buried memories drawn back into the light, revealing vast stretches of land where only sea had been. Continental shelves opened, not as barren mudflats, but as living landscapes, where grasses took root, where rivers found their courses, where ancient waters wound through newly formed valleys, where animals moved, and where human beings, if they were there, would have found pathways to walk, to hunt, to endure. One might imagine a morning in that distant age, a small band of people standing upon land that now lies deep beneath the sea, watching herds cross open grasslands, hearing water run through rivers that would never bear a name, never knowing that all of it existed only for a finite span of time. Everything rested upon a fragile balance between ice and water, between cold and warmth, between holding fast and letting go. And slowly, a question begins to form, like a cold current slipping into thought. What happens when that balance begins to shift? As global temperatures rose after about 20,000 years ago, the Earth did not change in a single upheaval, but awakened in pulses, in layers, in overlapping cycles, like a vast body stirring from a long sleep. The ice began to melt, not all at once, not in orderly fashion, but in ways that defied prediction, as masses that had remained stable for tens of thousands of years began to lose their internal equilibrium. Meltwater seeped through fractures, poured into valleys, flowed toward the oceans, carrying not only volume, but disturbance. It was not only ice that changed. The seas themselves began to expand as temperatures rose, their volume increasing like a slow, unrelenting breath. Sea levels did not rise gently, nor along any smooth and even line, but surged in pulses, in sudden leaps, at times so rapid they seemed to outrun intuition. Around 14,650 years ago, One of the most dramatic of these rises occurred when sea levels may have climbed by as much as 20 meters within just a few centuries, a brief interval on the scale of geology, yet enough to transform every landscape a human could know. Such surges were not singular events, but part of a sequence of fluctuations, rapid, then slow, rising, then pausing, like the heartbeat of a system remaking itself. And so another question emerges. If the waters did not rise steadily, but in pulses, in surges, how would coastal lands respond, forced to adapt to an ocean that never ceased its advance? By the beginning of the Holocene, around 11,700 years ago, sea levels had drawn close to their modern state, and the process continued until roughly 7,000 years ago, when most prehistoric coastlines gradually disappeared beneath the water. What had once been plains became bays, continental shelves became shallow seabeds, land bridges were severed, turning into islands, then isolated within encircling seas. Rivers that had once crossed broad territories found their lower reaches drowned, becoming estuaries, then widening into gulfs as though their very courses had been rewritten. A valley once used for hunting now lies beneath tens of meters of water. A migration corridor that once linked lands is broken into impassable distances. A region that once had a clear form is now only a flat expanse on the seafloor, where no direct trace remains of what once stood upon it. All of this unfolded not in an instant, but across thousands of years, slow enough to pass unnoticed at first, yet swift enough to erase the geographic memory of an entire world. From here, a shift in perspective begins to take shape, not as a firm conclusion, but as a quiet idea emerging in silence. The shallow seas of today, were they always seas, or are they lands transformed, reshaped by time, by temperature, by the movement of water and ice? In that sense, the ocean is not a beginning, but an outcome, the result of a process unfolding across tens of thousands of years. From vast ice sheets spanning millions of square kilometers, to a drowned ancient river, to a hunting ground no longer in existence, everything seems bound together in an unbroken chain of transformation. A single idea returns, quietly yet persistently, that water does not merely cover, it erases, that it does not only give life, it also carries memory away. If much of the prehistoric coastal world vanished before any form of record could preserve it, then what remains in the archaeological record is only a fragment of the whole. What has been lost may never be recovered intact, not because it did not exist, but because it lies beyond reach, beneath waters we have only just begun to understand. Perhaps the aim is not to find a complete city, a clear structure, an undeniable proof. Perhaps what is worth seeking are the traces of worlds that once existed and then disappeared, leaving behind not answers, but absence. And if such vast lands once existed and were lost, how many human stories were lost with them? After the end of the Ice Age, as the great ice masses of the world slowly withdrew, sea levels did not remain still, but rose in silence across many millennia, swallowing low-lying lands, wide river mouths, coastal plains where people once lived, travelled, fished, buried their dead, and began to call a place their home. From West Asia to South Asia, from the Mediterranean to East Asia, and further still into the flood traditions of the Americas, or the coastal memories stretching across Australia and the Pacific, something remarkable appears, not as a single piece of evidence, but as a slow and enduring rhythm embedded deep within humanity's collective memory. Many cultures, separated by distance, by language, by the time of their formation, still preserve stories strikingly alike in structure, where there is always an earlier world, a great flood, a group that survives, and a new order that emerges after the waters. What matters here is not the attempt to force all these stories back toward a single shared catastrophe, as though all human memory must arise from one common end of the world. What draws attention instead is the repetition itself. Why does water cling so deeply to ancient memory? Why do so many traditions remember loss through the same substance, the same fear, the same slow and unstoppable advance of sea, of river, of flood? When geology gives way to legend, people no longer preserve ancient shorelines, no longer retain measurements of sea level, but they hold on to the image of water approaching, of water crossing old boundaries, of water turning a familiar world into a place that can never be returned to. Within that field of memory, the figures of survivors emerge as anchors. In ancient Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim passes through a flood sent by the gods in a vessel of survival, carrying the seeds of life through destruction, becoming a figure later sought by those who wish to ask about life, death, and the limits of human fate. In the Hebrew tradition of the Levant, Noah too crosses the waters in an ark, yet here the flood is not only catastrophe, but bound to moral order, to the collapse of an old world and the beginning of a new history. In Indian tradition, Manu is warned of the great deluge, prepares his vessel, and survives through a message from the sacred realm. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha endure the flood sent by Zeus, only to face a challenge greater than survival itself: how to begin humanity anew after it has nearly been erased. In ancient China, the figure of Dayu does not follow the pattern of escape by boat, yet holds a memory no less profound. The memory of water as a force of chaos capable of undoing human life, and the need to master the flood so that the world might become habitable, cultivable, ordered. Seen more closely, these figures are not merely characters of religion or myth. They resemble vessels of memory, each preserving a fragment of a shared and ancient anxiety. The waters come, the old world disappears. A few pass beyond that boundary, carrying not only seeds, animals, or family, but the story of what was lost. Is that why these survivors bear such weight in memory? As though they are remembered not only for escaping death, but because they stand as bridges between two worlds, one before the waters and one after. Here, the recurring pattern becomes clearer. First, there is always a world that exists within the logic of the story, a settled order with communities, dwellings, daily life, and a sense of stability believed to endure. Then comes the flood, when water ceases to be mere landscape and becomes a force that alters everything, sometimes bearing divine character, sometimes cosmic scale, sometimes simply the image of a land submerged beyond recognition. After that, there is a group of survivors, or a chosen figure, warned, saved, or capable of leading others through destruction. And finally, there remains memory. Not memory as an exact record of events as geology might desire, but memory compressed into symbol, into story, into names, into narrative structures repeated across generations. Perhaps it is this final element that makes everything at once familiar and elusive. A story told across thousands of years will inevitably change its form, its voice, its language, its moral meaning. Yet beneath those layers of change there may remain a very old core of experience. In some coastal traditions, particularly in indigenous Australian memory, there are indications that oral stories may preserve traces of shoreline changes dating back to the post-glacial period, when seas advanced inland, when islands separated from continents, when former places of habitation became open water. This does not mean that every flood myth is a precise environmental record carried intact through time. It suggests instead a quieter possibility, that collective memory may endure far longer than we expect, especially when tied to the loss of landscape, to the disappearance of the very ground upon which people once stood. The question, then, becomes more difficult, yet more compelling. When a myth appears in many places, are we witnessing a universal structure of human imagination, or touching fragments of very ancient memory preserved in different ways by different cultures? Perhaps both are true, to some degree. Many scholars remain cautious, for there is no firm ground to connect each flood story to a single event, nor to claim that all deluge myths are direct memories of rising seas after the Ice Age. Most may reflect local floods, river disasters, ancient attempts to understand why water, which sustains life, can also erase it. Yet such caution does not compel us to conclude the opposite, that all is mere invention. Some coastal traditions may indeed have preserved memories of lost land, of insular isolation, of advancing seas across spans of time almost unimaginable to individual memory. If so, myth is neither a geological report nor merely a dream of religion. It may be memory compressed, a form so condensed that science cannot read it literally, yet not dismiss as meaningless illusion. Within that compression lie symbols, morality, fear, imagination, and perhaps also the distant echo of a vanished shoreline. As the perspective shifts, the landscapes that follow begin to change in meaning. They're no longer places summoned to prove whether an ancient myth is true or false, but real terrains, real continental shelves, real drowned plains, where people may once have lived before the waters rose too high. A vanished coastline does not automatically create myth, yet it may leave behind an experience of loss profound enough for cultural memory to preserve in its own way. Longer even than the shape of the shore itself. Perhaps that is why stories of water have never been only about punishment. At times, they speak of land lost, of boundaries withdrawn, of an older world that sank yet did not wholly vanish. For it continues to endure in story, in symbol, in the quiet unease that beneath the waters of today there may still lie sleeping a very early chapter of human history. What happens when we take the vast seas of today in our mind's eye, and then, quietly, set the waters aside as though time itself were retreating, revealing a continuous landmass stretching across Southeast Asia, where the Malay Peninsula joins with Borneo, Sumatra, Java, where horizons are no longer broken by oceans but run unbroken, like a map that has never been torn. Toward the end of the Pleistocene, some 20 to 15,000 years ago, sea levels stood about 120 meters lower than they do today, enough to turn this entire continental shelf into a vast expanse of land known as Sundaland. A tropical world that was not the edge of anything, but its very centre. Rivers moved across alluvial plains, dense forests covered the lowlands, estuaries opened into calm, life-rich waters, and all things seemed to exist within a balance that felt enduring. Within that space, hunter-gatherer groups moved without the constraint of seas. Riverine communities formed along great waterways. Early coastal populations lived where land and water met. All coexisted within a natural network where paths did not need to be drawn, but emerged instead from terrain, from currents, from the repeated movements of people and animals across generations. An unbroken land system, undivided, allowed everything to connect, from herds crossing grasslands to human groups tracing river courses in search of food, of exchange, of encounter, and then parting again as though the entire continent functioned as a single body, each part aware of the rest. Forests, marshes, great rivers, estuaries all interwoven, forming a layered ecosystem where life did not gather in one place, but spread quietly and continuously, like a living tapestry stretching for thousands of kilometers. Could it be that within such a world, the first human pathways were not narrow trails, but vast corridors linking an entire continent? Could it be that the memory of a lost great land did not begin in imagination, but in the lived experience of communities who once inhabited it? And then the waters began to return, not in a single overwhelming wave, not in a day when all things vanished, but as a slow shift, almost imperceptible within a single lifetime, yet unstoppable across generations as polar ice melted, as ancient ice sheets released their waters into the oceans, as sea levels rose, little by little. Around 15,000 years ago, the waters advanced from the edges of Sundaland, slipping first into the lowest depressions, as though reclaiming spaces that had once been theirs, then pressing inward, submerging coastal plains that had once been centres of life. Rivers that once flowed to the sea through wide estuaries began to change their form. Their lower reaches were gradually drowned, becoming shallow bays, then straits, where salt water intruded, where the boundary between land and sea grew indistinct. The process did not stop. It continued, year by year, generation by generation, memory by memory. A child born when the shoreline lay far away grows to see it draw closer and grows old as it reaches what had once been home. A world does not vanish in a single moment. It dissolves slowly in a quiet, irreversible unmaking. As the waters returned not once, but in layers, step by step, the very structure of the world began to change, not through sudden destruction, but through silent division. By the beginning of the Holocene, around 11,700 years ago, the process had gone too far to reverse. Sea levels approached those of today. Most of Sundaland lay beneath the water. Higher lands began to separate, becoming distinct islands. Borneo, Sumatra, Java, once parts of a single body, now stood apart, surrounded by water, like fragments of memory left behind from a vanished continent. Migration corridors were severed. Paths that once existed were gone. Groups that had moved freely across hundreds of kilometers of land were now confined to smaller spaces, isolated, compelled to adapt, to diverge. Languages began to separate, cultures began to branch, ecology shifted from island to island, from region to region, forming the diversity that endures to this day. Could it be that this very fragmentation helped give rise to one of the most biologically and culturally diverse regions on Earth? Could it be that the richness of the present was born from a profound loss in the past? One truth begins to emerge, though it is not easily accepted. It was not merely a few settlements that were lost, not merely a few traces erased, but an entire living landscape, a world where humans had lived, moved, adapted for thousands of years, no longer present upon the land. What remains are only the parts that rise above the islands, the fragments of a far greater whole. The rest lies beneath the water, silent, unrecorded, difficult to reach. The archaeological record we hold today lies largely upon land, upon what remains while a vast portion of the space once inhabited by humans has been submerged, beyond the reach of traditional methods of study. What does this mean? Could it be that the picture of the past we see is only what remains above the surface, while most of the story lies beneath? The Sunda shelf stands as an example that cannot be overlooked, not because it is exceptional, but because it reveals a broader possibility that large-scale geographical loss may carry with it a loss of history on the same scale. Not only isolated sites disappearing, but entire regions where human history unfolded, developed, and was then erased from the map as the waters rose. If a tropical continent once existed, held rivers, held people across generations, held paths, memories, interactions that were never written, then how many of its stories were lost before anyone could remember them? Let us redraw the map in the mind, not by the coastlines of today, but by a far more distant moment, at the end of the Ice Age and in the early millennia of the Holocene, when sea levels lay tens, then more than 100 meters below the present, when the spaces now stretched between the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Karimata, and the straits of today were not familiar waters, but a broad, low, gently sloping land surface holding freshwater depressions, damp plains, seasonal mudflats, and great rivers that quietly organized life long before history was ever written. Around 21,000 years ago, when sea levels may have fallen to roughly 116 meters below present, the core of the Sunda shelf appeared not as a chain of divided islands, but as a continuous landmass, vast enough to sustain basins, estuaries, floodplains, wetlands, and drainage networks governed by their own internal order. What now appears as empty space between islands, when seen through the depth of time, begins to take on the shape of a structured world, a world with rhythm, with clearly marked paths. It is here that ancient rivers emerge from the darkness of the seabed. They are no longer vague conjecture. Digital elevation models, bathymetric data, seismic profiles, and paleogeographic reconstructions have begun to reconnect the lines erased from the present surface. When sea levels are set back to depths of -50, -75, -100, or -120 meters, the sea withdraws like a curtain, revealing old basins and drainage axes. This space between Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and the Malay Peninsula no longer appears as separating waters, but as a low and continuous land surface where flows have direction, where sediments have pathways, where fresh water finds its own routes outward. Upon that surface, 4 major river systems once existed as the principal arteries of the Sunda landmass, from the Siam River system to the North Sunda River system, the East Sunda River system, and the Malacca Straits river system. Their names may sound distant, yet their logic is familiar. A river, in any age, does the same work. It connects high ground to low, inland to estuary, scattered freshwater spaces into a traversable, memorable, returnable landscape. And so the map changes colour, slowly from blue water to brown earth, from sea bays to river channels, from straits to valleys, until what appears is no longer emptiness between islands, but a land map with main rivers, tributaries, basins, mudflats, and low surfaces shifting with the seasons. Once there are rivers, it becomes almost impossible to avoid the next question along those waters: what once lived, once moved, once paused. A river system is not merely a form upon a map, it is the structure of life itself. Where a river bank is gentle enough, there is ground to step upon, places to rest, zones for foraging, waters for fishing, routes that remain stable as dry seasons come and go. Where an estuary opens wide, fresh water meets brackish tides, fish move with the currents, birds and animals gather, and the pathways of humans and animals intersect in rhythms repeated year after year. Where low plains connect regions now divided, inland corridors emerge for movement, exchange, settlement, the accumulation of knowledge, the accumulation of memory. Thus, the great river systems of Sunda were not merely conduits of water, but bridges between freshwater populations now fragmented across mainland Southeast Asia, the Malay Peninsula, and the Sunda Islands. A river may carry sediment. It may also carry patterns of movement, habits of dwelling, invisible paths remembered by generations through the body, long before maps, before writing. In the logic of landscape archaeology, this is what matters most. A river is not only terrain, but the framework of possibility, the possibility of living, of gathering, of repeating a journey long enough for space to become a place of belonging. Yet it is precisely because these lifelines were so vital that the return of the sea carried a deeper meaning than simple inundation. Marine transgression upon the Sunda shelf did not merely cover old land. It reorganized the entire surface, altering how sediments settled, how materials eroded, how older forms were cut away and reshaped under a new marine regime. Water did not arrive everywhere at once. It entered first the lowest grounds, the ancient river valleys, the depressions that once held fresh water and from there expanded outward. Old estuaries widened into bays. Valleys that once led water to the sea became straits or shallow seas. Routes that once followed coasts and rivers, so natural upon continuous land, were broken apart piece by piece. Low-lying basins, perhaps once freshwater lakes or inland wetlands, were gradually submerged beneath salt water through the Holocene transgression. What was lost first was not the inaccessible highlands, but the most habitable places, low plains, wide estuaries, the most livable lower courses, precisely where traces of life would have been most concentrated. The paradox is a quiet one, and a troubling one. The places most suited for human life may also have been the first to be taken by the sea. From here, the story's no longer simply that of a sunken land, but of an inland world once active, now fallen beyond the field of terrestrial history. If an ancient river once flowed where a strait lies today, might there have been settlements along its course, fishing grounds, seasonal meeting places, burial sites, nodes of social exchange, familiar routes linking one memory to another. It is possible. It may be more than possible. It may be far more than we tend to imagine when we hear the word sunken land. For land alone does not make a world. Rivers do. Rivers gather water, gather sediment, gather life, gather pathways, and from these material things, an order of living slowly forms. When modern research attempts to reconnect ancient rivers with present ones, what it restores is not only the shape of landscape, but the logic of human presence upon it. And so Sundaland no longer appears as a lost continent belonging to imagination, but as a space that once held river systems, ecologies, pathways, places where humans might have paused long enough for life to become stable. Such a world does not need monumental stone remains to be remembered. Sometimes a muddy bank, an estuary, a fish run, a reliable freshwater source is enough for generations to anchor themselves. If the most vital places for life often lie along rivers, then it may be that a vast portion of Southeast Asia's earliest memory did not vanish within forests but still rests, quietly, beneath the shallow waters that now seem so familiar. There was a time when the stretch of water between the island of Britain and the European mainland was not sea, but land, low grass, the edges of damp marshes, and rivers threading their way across a vast plain that today lies beneath the southern North Sea. After the last glacial maximum and into the middle reaches of the Holocene, this place did not appear as a stage briefly opened and swiftly closed, but endured through shifting phases of landscape, at times drier, at times wetter, sometimes continuous, sometimes cut apart by encroaching waters, until at last it slipped beneath the rising sea. Across those millennia, northwestern Europe was not divided by the familiar waters shown on modern maps. What is now seen as a natural boundary was once part of a single living space, a continuous expanse of land, a shared world through which one might pass without a boat, needing only to keep walking. From that reversal of perspective, the name Doggerland gains its weight. It is not merely a scholarly label coined in the late 20th century to name a vanished land. It is more like a door opening backward into the geological memory of Europe, where Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities once moved, dwelt, hunted, foraged, and passed the seasons upon ground that no longer shows itself at the surface. What matters is that the southern North Sea is not treated as an abstract void. It is understood as a region that still holds post-glacial land surfaces, traces of ancient landscapes, and the potential preservation of remains from the late Paleolithic and Mesolithic, making it one of the most vital places for understanding how the people of northwestern Europe lived after the great ice sheets began to withdraw. But how can a land now beneath water be seen again? How can one speak of rivers, of shores, of marshes, of paths, when all have lain under the sea for thousands of years? The answer does not come from imagination, but from a patience almost opposed to myth. Researchers such as Vince Gaffney, James Walker, and interdisciplinary teams working with marine seismic data, sediment cores, seabed geomorphology, digital models, and geoarchaeological surveys have not recreated Doggerland as a romantic vision, but have peeled it back layer by layer from faint signals, as though reading a map buried beneath water and mud. Seismic data reveals the channels of ancient rivers that once crossed the plain, old land surfaces, seasonal hollows that filled with water, and low margins where land and water once negotiated without rest. Sediment cores taken from dozens of sites across the North Sea serve as material witnesses, testing whether what reconstruction models suggest aligns with layers of soil, peat, sand, pollen, and lingering biological traces. From this, Doggerland emerges not as an empty stretch, nor as a lifeless bridge between shores, but as a structured landscape, shaped, contoured, and historical in its own right, altered slowly and deeply across millennia. The scale of that work alone invites a pause. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of early Holocene landscape have been mapped. Dozens of sediment cores have been drawn from dozens of locations. As data gathers upon data, the sense grows clearer that beneath the present sea lies not only seabed, but a world that once lived. From here, a larger question begins to take form. If Doggerland was not merely a passage, then who lived there? The answer, though never complete, is clear enough to alter how the entire region is seen. In scholarly reconstructions, Doggerland is always placed alongside its terrain, its river systems, its coastlines, its vegetation, its animals, and the presence of humans. It is understood from the outset as a complete inhabited landscape. The archaeological record of northwestern Europe shows that hunter-gatherer communities were present here at least 13,000 years ago. They did not remain fixed in one place, but moved with the seasons, with herds, with fresh water, with the rhythms of post-glacial lowlands, a land of rivers, marshes, inland waters, and ecologically rich zones such as this could sustain Mesolithic life over long spans of time. Then small fragments of evidence begin to surface, like memories not yet dissolved. Along the coasts of the Netherlands and Britain, objects drawn up by trawling nets, fragments of bone, antler, wood, even human remains, turn the idea of a lost inhabited region into something no longer vague. Each object alone may seem small, a shard of bone, a tool, a fragment of a human body, but set beside one another, within the same geography, within the same story of rising seas, they begin to speak in a different voice, that there was once fresh water here, that there were hunting grounds, that there were paths, that there were people, that there was home, in the deepest sense of the word, not a house of walls and roof as in later times, but a lived space so familiar that people could read the seasons in the wind, the water in the soil, the movements of animals across surfaces that now sleep beneath the sea. The tragedy of Doggerland lies in the fact that it did not vanish in a single moment. There was no clean line between existence and disappearance. As sea levels rose after the Ice Age, the land shrank slowly, broken apart, severed, worn away first at its lowest points. Marshes, river margins, and seasonally wet low surfaces, though richest in resources, were also the most fragile. The submergence of Doggerland cannot be read simply from the present shape of the North Sea floor, as though the old world could be seen intact by looking downward. What remains beneath the water has been altered through repeated phases of transgression, erosion, deposition, and renewal. Water did not merely cover the land, it rewrote its final form. At this point, the understanding of the North Sea shifts entirely. The sea is no longer something that has always been there from the beginning. It becomes the final layer laid over part of the northwestern European plain that once had its own terrain, ecology, inhabitants, and rhythms of life. Thus, when Doggerland is sometimes invoked as a drowned country. The meaning of that phrase lies not in politics, but in landscape. A complete world has been erased from the surface map, not because it never existed, but because the shoreline withdrew so slowly that even human memory could no longer hold its full shape. Here, the central argument of the entire narrative becomes more tangible than ever. A post-glacial inhabited landscape covered by the sea is not mere legend. It can be traced, partially reconstructed, and returned to history through interdisciplinary science. Doggerland is therefore not only a place that was lost, it is proof that what sinks does not wholly disappear. Sometimes it merely changes the medium in which it is preserved, from dry land to seabed, from direct memory to seismic signal, from footprints in mud to cold sediment cores lifted after thousands of years. And from that landscape, another question begins to rise quietly, gentle yet heavy, like still water before a greater upheaval. If Doggerland was once home, once a path, once a real inhabited land, then how did the people who lived there watch the waters come, year by year, generation by generation, or as a memory stretched so long that no one could tell it whole? Around 8,150 years ago, in roughly 6,200 BCE, as the late Holocene opened after millennia of melting ice and steadily rising seas, Doggerland was no longer the broad and continuous land it had once been, but a low, wet, yielding world, broken into fragile strips, half-submerged marshlands, widening estuaries, and vulnerable shallow shores, lying between the North Sea and the coasts of northwestern Europe, like a memory fading even as it endured. There, Mesolithic communities still lived, still hunted, still moved across shallow waters and the remaining low ground, still relied upon a landscape rich in fish, in birds, in sustenance, yet growing ever more uncertain. Off the coast of Norway, beneath the cold and dark seabed, another movement was gathering, not of human rhythm, not of season or tide, but of geology, of immense masses that can lie still for ages and then collapse without warning. The question was no longer only whether there was water, whether there was flooding, but how a world already worn by water, thinned by water, would withstand the blow when it came. In the centuries before that event, the sea did not enter Doggerland like an army rushing in a single morning, but like a patient cold hand, day after day, generation after generation, taking away each edge of land, each strip of shore, each hollow, until the continuity of the landscape itself began to fracture. Low shores grew unstable, marshlands became harder to read, estuaries, where life gathered, also became the most sensitive to every surge of water. A place could be abundant and fragile at once. This was the paradox of coastal worlds, and perhaps Doggerland in its final phase lived entirely within that paradox. On some morning, a group may have stepped from their shelter, looked upon the water as their ancestors had, seen the land still there, reeds still swaying, birds still settling, and thought that though the world was changing, it remained familiar enough to endure. Yet was that very familiarity the most dangerous thing? When a landscape continues to sustain life even as it silently loses its strength to hold together, Storegga did not fall upon an intact land. It struck a world already wounded, worn by the sea, weakened by water, and that is what made the disaster far more severe than any simple image of a single wave. Then, off the coast of Norway, one of the largest submarine landslides that modern science can trace took place. A vast mass of material on the edge of the continental shelf collapsed, on a scale that defies ordinary intuition, spreading across some 80,000 square kilometres, with a volume of roughly 3,200 cubic kilometres, so immense that in the mind's eye it no longer appears as a landslide, but as a portion of the seabed itself shifting. From that movement, a paleo-tsunami travelled across the North Sea, reaching many surrounding coasts as a surge no longer belonging to the familiar rhythms of the sea. Its traces appear in sediment layers in western Scandinavia, in the Faroe Islands, in northeastern Britain, in Denmark, in Greenland, and further still, with growing evidence that its reach extended to the southern coasts of Britain. A motion that began in darkness beneath the Norwegian Sea carried its force to the low margins of the North Atlantic and the North Sea. The scale of it invites the telling of an apocalyptic moment, a wave that appears and erases all. Yet here one must slow, for the magnitude of an event does not itself yield a clear answer to the fate of an entire world. When the tsunami came, the most vulnerable places would have been the low shores, the estuaries, the depressions, the lands already near the water's edge, for the communities still living on what remained of Doggerland. This may have been a surge beyond anything they had known, beyond tide, beyond seasonal flood, beyond the memory of a single life. The water did not come as a cycle, but as a break. It did not come as a warning, but as a judgment. Yet was that judgment the same everywhere? Were all low shores crushed alike? All groups sharing one fate? All land vanishing in a single day? The closer one looks, the more cautious the answer becomes. Earlier views once cast Storegga as the final inundation, a total destruction of Doggerland. But newer readings suggest a more complex picture. The impact of the tsunami was uneven. Terrain varied from place to place. Exposure to the open sea differed. Human communities did not necessarily dwell in the same ways. Moreover, the period was shaped by concurrent processes, from post-glacial sea level rise to the climatic shifts of the 8.2K event, making it exceedingly difficult to isolate the role of a single wave from the broader field of change. Some parts of Doggerland may have remained after the Great Floods, with certain surfaces still above sea level until around 7,000 years ago. This does not diminish the event. It only makes it more real. For what may be most fearful is not the moment when the waters stand highest, but the way loss unfolds across time. What weighs more heavily upon a coastal world? A single day shattered by a violent surge, or generations watching their living land shrink, retreat, fade, until places once at the heart of memory become the water's edge, then the seabed. Storegga may have been a great chapter in the tragedy of Doggerland, a geological blow strong enough to mark the entire North Sea. Yet it was not the only chapter, nor necessarily the final end. Rising seas, contracting lowlands, shifting climate, and then a colossal collapse off Norway, all layered together like cold waters passing over a dissolving map. Perhaps this is closest to the truth. Not a world erased in a single instant, but one worn away by time, then struck harder by catastrophe. If a northern land could vanish in such a way, in cold waters, in shallow seas, along retreating shores, then what of other lowlands of prehistory? In warmer south, along other coasts, across other plains. How did they disappear? And how many memories of humankind have sunk not because they never were, but because the waters came too slowly to become myth, yet too deeply to remain seen? Today, the Persian Gulf appears as a stretch of salt water bound to oil tankers, ports, shipping lanes, and the searing dryness of West Asia, a body of sea that seems to have held this form for a very long time, stable, familiar, almost incapable of being otherwise. Yet if one steps far enough back, to the end of the Pleistocene and into the beginning of the Holocene, that image begins to waver. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26.5 to 19,000 years ago, global sea levels stood about 120 to 130 meters lower than today, enough for the floor of the Gulf to rise above the water and turn what is now a shallow sea into an exposed basin beneath an ancient sky. And from there, a question begins to form, slowly, as cold water seeps into memory if what is now salt water was once land. Was it merely a barren emptiness, or might it have been a space capable of holding life, in a time when much of the Arabian interior often faced aridity, instability, and the absence of water sources durable enough to sustain long-term habitation? At the intersection of exposed land, harsh climate, and the need to endure, the familiar image of the present begins to invert for what is now salt water, vessels, and heat may once have been a lowland where fresh water determined who could remain and who must depart. From that point, the Gulf Oasis hypothesis draws its strength not from the promise of a radiant legend, but from a far quieter logic, one closer to human ecology than to the allure of a sunken city. In 2010, Geoffrey V. Rose proposed a model that has since been widely discussed in studies of the Arabo-Persian Gulf's prehistory, bringing together paleo-environmental, archaeological, and genetic data from Arabia and southern Iran to consider the possibility of a vast oasis within that basin. What is striking is that this hypothesis does not assert the existence of a lost civilization beneath the Gulf, nor does it cast those waters as an eastern Atlantis. It offers instead a more restrained and more profound possibility that as Arabia's interior grew increasingly arid through multiple climatic phases, human populations may have contracted into more favourable environmental refugia along the margins and within the basin itself, where water, life, mobility routes, and subsistence rhythms could endure more steadily than in the deserts behind them. If this holds even in part, what emerges is not a mythical empire, but a broad, quiet, practical refuge, a place sufficient for survival through harsh periods, sufficient to preserve some of the earliest links in Arabia's history, links that the sea would later cover with another layer of silence. The weight of this model lies in an environmental equation, for in prehistory the decisive question is seldom whether monuments exist, but whether water exists, whether food can be found, whether life can persist through the dry season. Geological studies of the Gulf suggest that around 21,000 to 20,000 years ago, when sea level stood roughly 120 meters below present, this region formed a basin not yet filled by the sea, an exposed depression rather than a surface of water. At the same time, many phases at the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene in Arabia were marked by aridity, rendering scattered habitation across the desert interior precarious. In such a setting, a vast lowland within the Gulf, if supplied by river systems, by moisture-retaining depressions, by seasonal or more enduring freshwater sources, would have held a wholly different attraction. For what draws human beings to a place in the earliest times is rarely splendour, but something far more elemental that place is livable, enough water to remain, enough resources to gather into a rhythm of survival, enough stability that groups do not merely pass through, but return, and then remain longer than a season. Thus, within the logic of the Gulf Oasis, the focus does not lie on whether cities existed, but on a deeper question: could this place have served as a node of demographic concentration in the prehistory of Arabia? When a land can hold water, it often holds pathways, herds, and the fragile yet decisive movements of human life. And so the imagination, if kept within the bounds of evidence, may travel a little further without slipping into exaggeration, for a vast, low-lying basin, exposed when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, need not have been a lifeless desert. It may have been a far more intricate landscape, with freshwater bodies, marshy depressions, ground soft enough to preserve the tracks of animals, and river corridors that carried life across an otherwise difficult terrain. What would such a space do to human beings? Perhaps what every refugium has done throughout natural history: it gathers what might otherwise disperse. It draws animals toward water, making certain places into hunting grounds. It preserves shelters, movement routes, and the rhythms of foraging and return. It links eastern Arabia with adjacent regions not through walls, but through terrain, through water, through the capacity to sustain life. Rose's hypothesis does not require a narrative of a super-civilization to carry significance. It need only be a demographic refugium, a place capable of maintaining human density as surrounding environments grow harsher, to become a crucial link in the region's prehistory. And perhaps here lies its true allure, not in the promise of a glittering myth, but in the possibility that beneath the modern sea once lay a world profoundly ordinary, deeply organic, undeniably real, where life clung to fresh water as though to a memory not yet written. Yet every refugium exists under fragile conditions, for it endures only so long as the balance of survival holds. From the beginning of the Holocene, the sea advanced into the Gulf. The once exposed basin gradually filled again with salt water during post-glacial transgression, and thereafter experienced further fluctuations in sea level throughout the Holocene. If there had been shorelines, lowlands, habitation corridors, or simply patches of dry ground sufficient to stand within a network of fresh water and life, they too would have vanished beneath the modern sea. The reversal in this part of history lies not in action, but in perception. What is now associated with ports, oil, geopolitics, and dense shipping routes may once have been a terrestrial landscape with freshwater edges, open ground, pathways, wild animals, and human presence. A submerged world does not exist only along northern continental shelves or within temperate regions more frequently discussed. It may also lie at the very strategic heart of modern West Asia. Of course, this remains a strong hypothesis rather than a closed conclusion, a possibility grounded enough to consider, yet not a finished picture. And perhaps it is precisely this incompleteness that allows the final question to linger: if a refugium once existed where the Persian Gulf now lies, then beneath those waters of salt and commerce might there rest not a mythical city, but a very real, very early, and easily forgotten link in the dawn of Arabian history. In the early millennia of the Holocene, roughly between 8,800 and 7,600 years ago, according to differing models, the Black Sea appears as a broad and quiet body of water, seemingly belonging only to geography, yet in truth poised upon a delicate boundary between several distinct worlds of water. There lay the Black Sea itself, the Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, the coasts of northern Anatolia and eastern Europe, all together forming a highly sensitive hydrological node, where a mere difference in elevation, a shift in connection thresholds, a reversal of flow could alter the environmental history of the entire region. If the Black Sea at that time was indeed a freshwater or brackish lake lying lower than the Mediterranean and Marmara systems, then what would occur when the gateway between these basins began to open? How swiftly would water enter? By what mechanism? Would it surge as a sudden blow or seep in as an inexorable transformation? Along those margins, where early communities may have farmed, fished, gathered resources, the question reaches beyond sediment or stratigraphy into the realm of dwelling, memory, remaining, or being forced to depart. It was within these seemingly calm waters that two names would later become inseparable from the debate: William Ryan and Walter Pittman. What gives the hypothesis of a great Black Sea inundation its enduring power lies not only in its science, but in the near completeness of the story it forms. According to the widely circulated scenario from the late 20th century, the Bosporus once served as a natural barrier between the Black Sea and the waters beyond Marmara, and further still, the Mediterranean. When the southern waters rose sufficiently, when the difference between the two sides grew large enough, that barrier may have been overtopped, allowing salt water from a higher sea to pour into a lower basin. One need only imagine an ancient shoreline at rest, lowlands inhabited, and then the waters advancing further, advancing without end, to understand the compelling force of this idea. A foundational study published in 1997 described the possibility that the Black Sea's coastal shelf was submerged abruptly, as though the boundary between land and water retreated within a span still short enough to fall within the scale of human life, of collective memory, of oral history. Could fields have vanished, landing places shifted, familiar paths sunk beneath the water within a few generations, perhaps even sooner? Could such an event, if it occurred at sufficient scale, have left echoes in cultural memory, in stories of rising waters, of punishment, of an older world consumed? The idea is almost self-telling in its beauty, for it binds geology to myth, shoreline to memory, environmental change to the formation of flood legends across the crossroads of West Asia and Eastern Europe. Yet the more compelling the narrative, the more it demands that science proceed with care. The more elegant it appears, the more it invites scrutiny at every layer of evidence. Following Ryan and Pittman, numerous studies revisited the question through geomorphology, sedimentology, isotopes, mollusks, and the history of flow through the Bosporus, arriving at far more cautious conclusions. The first question concerns speed. Was there truly a catastrophic surge in the sense of a sudden disaster? Or does the paleo-environmental record reveal a more complex reconnection, with phases of rapid change embedded within a longer transition? The second question concerns the initial state of the Black Sea. Was it indeed an isolated freshwater lake, or a brackish basin with a far more intricate history of exchange with Marmara? The third question is more difficult still, touching upon the direction of flow itself. Some recent syntheses suggest that evidence during the Holocene continues to support a sustained outflow from the Black Sea toward the eastern Mediterranean, contrary to the image of a one-directional influx of saltwater characteristic of the flood model. If the direction of flow was more complex than first imagined, then the entire narrative must change accordingly. What is most striking is that the evidence does not vanish, but refuses to settle into a single interpretation. The same sediment layer may be read by one group as a sign of relatively rapid inundation, and by another as evidence of gradual salinization, of extended phase transitions, of multi-step reconnection between water systems. The same hydrological shift may be described as a sudden intrusion by some, and as the result of overlapping processes by others, too complex to be told as a single catastrophe. The question of human impact follows the same pattern. If water levels did change significantly along the Black Sea's margins, was that change uniform everywhere, equally intense for all communities, immediately sufficient to form a shared collective experience? A long shoreline rarely tells only one story. A broad coastal zone seldom moves to a single rhythm. Here, land may have been lost swiftly. There it may have receded slowly over centuries. Here a group may have been forced to leave, there another may have adapted. The deeper one goes into detail, the harder it becomes to preserve the image of a single, neat, all-powerful flood. Thus, the connection between the Black Sea and flood mythology must be held at a distance that is close enough to provoke thought, yet far enough to avoid premature certainty. The Black Sea lies near major crossroads of West Asia and Eastern Europe, along corridors of human movement, exchange, storytelling, remembrance, forgetting, and retelling. If there was indeed a significant rise of water in some form, if old shores were erased and inhabitants forced from familiar lands, then the possibility that it fed into later flood memories remains entirely conceivable. But it should remain there, no further, no faster. One should not claim that the Black Sea is the origin of the Great Flood as though all debate has ended, for current scholarship does not permit such a conclusion. What may be retained with greater composure is a subtler idea that myth is not always pure invention, but may be the worn echo of real environmental change carried across generations, languages, and layers of memory until only the faint shape of water remains, of loss, of a vanished shore. The climax of this story therefore lies not in choosing decisively between sides. On one side stands the powerful allure of an inundation great enough to imprint itself upon ancient memory, strong enough to cross from geology into legend. On the other stands the necessary caution of science, which reminds us that evidence rarely speaks in a single voice, rarely offers a fully closed answer. This uncertainty does not weaken the narrative, it deepens it. For some questions linger longer precisely because they remain unresolved. Some waters, the less they yield a single story, the more one feels that beneath their surface something remains unspoken. The Black Sea thus preserves an important possibility that it may have undergone a water level change significant enough to affect coastal communities, perhaps even to leave some trace within regional cultural memory. At the same time, it reinforces a principle that must accompany this entire journey, the more compelling the hypothesis. the slower the telling must be. The more beautiful the story, the lighter the hands that hold it. And if there truly were places where water reshaped shores, altered lives, entered memory and remained there as a faint line across millennia, then might there exist a submerged site no longer as a matter of broad debate, but as a real dwelling, a real village, a real trace beneath the water, waiting in silence to be seen. After vast plains that once bound land to land, after continental shelves that once opened like immense gates in an age when sea level stood low, the view now narrows, draws closer, sharpens into something far more intimate. Off the Carmel coast of Israel, only 200 to 400 meters from the present shoreline, at a depth of some 8 to 12 meters beneath the sea, there is a place whose time is set within the pre-pottery Neolithic sea, around 6,900 to 6,300 BCE. A place often spoken of simply as a submerged village some 9,000 years old. The question no longer sweeps across immense paleogeographic maps too vast to be held within imagination. It descends instead to a human scale, where there were dwellings, fresh water, burials, daily labour, a community that once existed in undeniable reality. What was once a hypothesis stretched across the planet grows quieter, smaller, yet harder to dismiss. For here, history is not merely something that might have sunk beneath the sea. Here, history is truly lying beneath it. It is this very concreteness that sets Atlit-Yam apart. It does not appear as a legend blurred by salt mist, nor does it linger as a name too beautiful not to drift toward myth. It stands as an archaeological site that can be surveyed, measured, documented, read layer by layer through what remains. The name most closely bound to this place is Ehud Galili, who devoted many years to studying submerged prehistoric sites along the Carmel coast, transforming Atlit-Yam from a marvel on the seabed into a serious point of reference in underwater prehistory, through surveys, excavations, architectural descriptions, the identification of wells, burials, and traces of subsistence. A picture emerges, slowly, as though the sea has never hidden everything, only held it beneath a thinner veil than our imagination assumes. When a sight reaches such clarity, the question itself changes. It is no longer whether there is anything beneath the water. It becomes something quieter, closer, almost touching the daily life of a vanished community. In this place, how did people live? The answer begins with what endures. Stone-built structures and dwellings reveal that this was not a fleeting stop along a path of movement, but a stable settlement, a place where people reigned long enough to arrange their living space with deliberate order. Most striking among these is a stone-lined well, now resting about 10 meters below today's sea level, a small detail that nearly reshapes the entire sense of the site. For a well speaks more than a hollow filled with water. It speaks of staying. It speaks of an intention to belong to the land. It speaks of an early effort to draw from coastal groundwater. From the early 8th millennium before present, perhaps even earlier. Beside it lie burials and funerary practices, showing that this place was not only for the living but also for the dead, not only for labour but for memory, not only for the present but for holding those who had passed through yesterday. Other traces gather, fitting together like shards of a life once broken, yet not entirely lost. Evidence suggests a mixed subsistence, farming, herding, hunting, and fishing, placing the inhabitants precisely at the meeting point of land and sea, of fresh water and salt, of crops inland and food drawn from offshore. There are also stone structures bearing a ritual character, arrangements with a megalithic quality, suggesting that this was not merely a place to shelter or survive, but a space of belief, of collective practice, of those acts people turn to when they have lived long enough in one place to call it home. As each quiet detail stands beside the next, Atlit-Yam ceases to be an archaeological site in the cold sense of the term. It begins to become a village, a real village, a village slowly emerging beneath the water. From there, the most intimate layer of the story opens. One can imagine a figure bending over the mouth of the stone well, drawing water from the coastal aquifer in the soft light of a morning nearly 9 millennia past. One can imagine the living spaces arranged within the structures, where work, rest, storage, and gathering unfolded in familiar order. One can imagine people working along the shore, living from fish, from livestock, from crops, from all that the shifting boundary between sea and land could offer. One can imagine burial rites, hands lowering a loved one into the earth, memories preserved through the simplest yet most enduring acts a community can perform. Is this what gives Atlit-Yam its quiet power? That it does not compel us to imagine a lost world too grand to believe, but instead places before us an ordinary rhythm of life, and lets that very ordinariness become the shock. The weight of this place lies there. No need for a mythical continent, no need for towering stone monuments, no need for an empire erased from every record to sense that layers of human history have been taken by the sea. A single, real village, with a real well, real burials, real architecture, real subsistence, now lying beneath the water, is enough to collapse the distance between present and past into a silence almost overwhelming. They're no longer a distant ancient people beyond feeling. They become human beings who once lived ordered lives, with labour, with loss, with memory, like every community that followed, like every community that came before. From here, the broader hypothesis of the film shifts in tone. It no longer stands entirely within the haze of speculation, for at least one thing is certain: real human settlements now lie beneath the sea. Atlit-Yam does not ask us to believe in a great flood retold through layers of myth. It asks only that we look down into the water, long enough, close enough, to accept a quiet truth, that the sea has taken not only land, but houses, short paths through a village, places where water was drawn, places where the dead were laid, fragments of lives once utterly ordinary. If a single village such as this is enough to show that history can sink layer by layer, like sediment covering memory, then how many other places, small, ordinary, yet once home to someone, still lie beyond our sight beneath the sea? There was a time, far in the past, when the Bering Strait was not a cold band of water dividing Asia and North America as it is today, but a vast land exposed beneath the Ice Age sky, revealed when immense volumes of the planet's water were locked in ice, lowering sea levels by tens of meters, nearly 300 feet below present, unveiling a landscape the modern world can scarcely see. During the last glacial maximum, especially between about 26,000 and 519,000 years ago, and extending into the early post-glacial period. What is now the Bering Strait was not merely a boundary between continents, but a continuum, a transitional land, a gateway of earth and wind. Much of that land now lies beneath the waters of the Chukchi and Bering Seas, submerged along with ancient shores, coastal stretches, and possible stopping points once lining the northeastern edge of the Pacific. The question grows quieter, yet deeper. If the first steps into the Americas pass through a world no longer above water, then is the opening of that story hidden within its own geography. When the sea falls, paths emerge. This is true at the scale of the planet, where ice spreads across continents, waters retreat from margins, and new lands rise as though maps rewrite themselves. It is also true at the scale of human lives, though no names remain, no faces endure. For those first groups did not walk into emptiness, but moved through a living landscape, changing century by century, millennium by millennium, where great animals migrated, vegetation spread, where stretches of land linking Siberia to Alaska formed corridors of movement. Some founding populations of the Americas may have lived within parts of Beringia during the glacial maximum, dwelling in a quiet waiting shaped by climate, by ice, by the opening of a path southward. Yet this path was perhaps never a simple, dry bridge. It may also have been a chain of coastal environments stretching south, where ice along the northwestern Pacific began to retreat around 18,000 years ago, revealing viable shorelines even before inland corridors fully opened. Seen this way, the first route into the Americas is no longer a line across a map, but a softer network of tidal flats, estuaries, headlands, seasonal foraging grounds, pauses between cold winds and dark waters, ancient coasts that no longer exist above the surface. Yet it is there that the story begins to fade, like a footprint on wet sand. If the coastal route held importance, then its evidence lies precisely where later rising seas erased it most completely. After about 11,000 years ago, sea levels rose again, submerging the low-lying landscapes along the Pacific, taking with them not only potential settlements, but also landing places, brief hearths, temporary living surfaces, pauses along the journey. A lost village is already difficult to find. A lost path is far more elusive, for a path is not only its beginning and end, but all the spaces between, all the places where people stopped, observed, waited for fish runs, sheltered from wind, repaired tools, and moved on. If the first people truly followed the northeastern Pacific Rim, drawing from rich coastal resources, from dense kelp forests, shallow estuaries, low islands now vanished, then much of the material logic of that journey may have been submerged from an early time. Archaeology thus faces not only absence but a structured absence, for what must be found lies beneath water, beneath sediment, along shores still eroding, within a realm where even the memory of geography grows fragile. From here, what is lost is no longer only land, it is the path itself. A single site may be discovered by chance, an ancient route, especially one running along coasts now drowned, dissolves far more easily into silence. After the glacial maximum, as seas rose rapidly, the Bering Land Bridge shrank, with the most significant loss occurring between about 10,000 and 8,500 years ago. In geological time, this is but a brief pulse. In human history, it may be enough to erase the entire context of a founding migration. Landscapes once crossed may have vanished before leaving behind an accessible archaeological record. A place that was once a landing ground becomes the seabed. An inlet that once sheltered becomes a cold expanse below water. A promontory that once offered the first view south becomes a submerged contour on sonar maps. The story of the first entry into the New World may therefore always be divided, one half remaining on land, enough to suggest, to argue, to build hypotheses, while the other lies beyond direct reach, preserving not only places but sequences of movement, rhythms of travel and pause, the very logic of the journey. The strongest idea here does not arrive as a dazzling discovery, but as a quiet chill spreading through the imagination. The most important path in the human history of the Americas may lie beneath the sea. Not only settlements have sunk, not only traces of daily life have been lost, an entire route may have disappeared, a route that once shaped how people spread across this continent, once connected two worlds when waters were low, then was erased when the planet warmed. This deepens the film's hypothesis and darkens it, for the ocean does not only hold what people built, it may also hold what they once walked. That founding moment may not have vanished entirely, it may still remain, in drowned coasts, in cold sediments, in ancient bays now turned to still grey water. If someone once passed here for the first time, paused upon a shore that no longer exists, looking toward a horizon that would become sea, then perhaps a part of that moment still rests beneath the water, waiting to be known only through faint, indirect traces, enough to remind us that history is not always lost, but sometimes simply held by the sea. Is it true that beneath the surface there remain entire cities, intact, waiting to be revealed by a single descent, like a forgotten door sealed within the folds of history? The thought arises easily, almost without effort, for the imagination is drawn to completeness, to clear structures, to decisive moments of discovery. Yet reality moves differently, and that difference begins with the very way we search. Survey vessels glide slowly across the North Sea, the Mediterranean, the waters off Alaska, or the deep reaches of the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, not to see, but to listen, not to touch, but to read the invisible signals rising from the seabed. Long before any diver enters the water, acoustic maps, reflected seismic waves, faint contours within the data have already been traced, layer by layer, as though the past were speaking in a language entirely its own. In laboratories far from shore, sediment cores are opened, each thin layer like a page, each bearing the imprint of time, of currents, of life that once existed. Those who work there do so in silence, not to find at once, but to assemble, to distinguish, to question. A signal may be the trace of a buried ancient river, yet it may just as well be a natural geological form. A straight line may suggest the hand of man, yet it may also be the work of erosion. Nothing is certain, everything must be tested. And from this, another understanding slowly forms, that underwater archaeology does not begin with seeing, but with doubting what seems to have been seen. When expectations are set aside, another question comes into clearer view if there is no intact world beneath the water waiting to be opened. Then what makes the search so slow, so difficult? Water does not merely cover what once was. It alters, reshapes, rewrites it in its own manner. Surfaces that once held human life do not lie beneath the sea like images preserved beneath glass, but are buried beneath tens of meters of water, and then beneath layers of sediment laid down over time. Currents carry sand, mud, organic matter, filling valleys, blurring original forms, until an ancient river remains only as a faint trace within seismic data, like a memory softened by many veils. Ancient coastlines are worn away, cut back, drawn inland, then buried again in an unceasing sequence of change. Depressions gather new material, slowly covering what once lay beneath. Microtopography shifts, gradually yet without pause, until a settlement or lagoon edge once clear becomes only a faint geometric signal, easily missed, easily mistaken. What archaeology must face is not a preserved world, but a dynamic environment, where every trace has been altered, deformed, restructured across time. Even when some fragment of the old landscape remains beneath those layers of mud and sand, another difficulty emerges. The things most often used in daily life are rarely the most enduring. Wood, fibre, leather, light structures, small posts, materials simple yet essential to lived reality, seldom survive thousands of years in submerged conditions, especially where chemical and biological environments are unstable. What remains is fragmentary, incomplete, discontinuous, like stories broken into scattered pieces. It is a quiet paradox that the least noticed things often tell the clearest stories. A layer of peat, a grain of pollen, a small shell. A sediment core that seems without meaning may hold within it the memory of environments, of currents, of shifting landscapes. A great structure may vanish, yet a grain of pollen endures. A house may disappear, yet a layer of sediment remembers. Thus, discovery beneath the water rarely takes the form of clear images, but appears instead as a chain of small, cold, patient data, requiring endurance more than excitement. Then another paradox reveals itself. Even stone, thought to be the most enduring of materials, is not so easily read. A structure of stone beneath the sea may resemble a foundation, a circle, a line. Yet such forms may also arise from natural processes, from erosion, from currents, from long accumulation. To distinguish between nature and human work becomes a problem beyond intuition. A sonar image may suggest a structure, but cannot confirm it. A flat surface may be a human trace, yet it may also be a geological plane. And so research teams must draw together many layers of data, bathymetric maps, seismic signals, sediment cores, and, when possible, direct imagery. In shallow waters, humans may descend and measure, but in greater depths, machines take their place, moving through darkness, recording incomplete images that must be interpreted. Only when signals converge, when multiple layers of data point in the same direction, does an anomaly beneath the water begin to take shape as something credible. Technology does not reveal the past at once. It allows questions to become more precise, vision to reach deeper, and acceptance that answers will come slowly. Looking back upon this process, one truth becomes clearer. Science beneath the water advances not by sudden discoveries but by accumulation. An ancient river course, a layer of peat, a shoreline trace, a biological signal, a topographic anomaly. Each is small, each insufficient alone, yet together they begin to form a picture, not complete, yet enough to suggest a world. Modern tools open the possibility of reading deeper layers of the seabed, from reflected seismic signals to sediment core analysis, to the recognition of biological traces that remain. A vast landscape that once existed may be reconstructed not through a single act of seeing, but through thousands of data points, spread across great distances, assembled like fragments of a shattered map. The culmination of this journey does not lie in the moment a city appears, but in a shift of vision. What must be awaited is not a complete image, but a slow process, where each small detail gradually shapes a whole, a patience almost opposed to imagination, yet closer to the way the past truly endures. If science moves forward through fragments, through faint signals, through years of patience, then perhaps it is this very slowness that lends the story its truth, for it does not emerge as sudden revelation, but rises gradually, piece by piece, as the past has always risen from beneath the water. If a world sinks, what remains to tell of it? The question seems simple, yet the deeper one moves into underwater archaeology, the more quietly complex it becomes. From the end of the Pleistocene into the early Holocene, as ice melted and sea levels rose across long millennia, most ancient coastlines and their hinterlands disappeared beneath the water, before the relative stability of modern sea levels after around 7,000 years before present. This means that when we look toward Atlit-Yam off the Carmel coast, toward Doggerland beneath the North Sea, toward the ancient river systems of the Sunda shelf, toward the submerged shores of the Black Sea, or toward the elusive paleosaurolines of Alaska and the North Pacific, we are not looking upon an intact archive of the past, but upon what remains after a long and unforgiving process of selection. The sea does not only take land, it selects memory. Some things endure, enduring enough to lie within sediment, beneath salt water, beneath the dense layers of time, still able to tell fragments of ancient life. Others are far more fragile, disappearing almost at once when the environment changes, as though they had never been, and so the archaeological record beneath the sea is never even. It does not preserve all things alike. It keeps what is heavier, harder, deeper, more indirect. It erases what is soft, intimate, vivid, what lies closest to human life. When something is truly found upon the seabed, what appears first is rarely an intact village, rarely a life preserved as if frozen in time, but rather the more enduring fragments of a vanished world. At Atlit-Yam, a stone well may lie 10 meters beneath the water, still present, a dense core of memory from a pre-pottery coastal life. Its stone structure, its depth, its material stability, all grant it a chance of survival far greater than the things that once surrounded it. And yet even such a structure is enough to suggest a logic of existence, that people once came here not merely to pass, but to draw fresh water, to remain, to shape their lives around a source at the edge of the sea. In Doggerland, what remains may not be walls or roofs, but peat cores, grains of pollen, layers of sediment that preserve traces of vegetation once spread across land now covered by the North Sea. These grains are so small as to be nearly invisible, yet their smallness holds a strange endurance. They allow the reconstruction of plant histories, suggesting the environments that post-glacial hunter-gatherers once knew, once crossed, once inhabited. A grain of pollen names no individual, yet it speaks of marsh, of woodland, of grassland, of season. Perhaps this too is a form of survival, not as large objects, but as thin ecological signals, deep, difficult to see, yet true. Across the Sunda shelf and in many paleo landscapes, what survives may not be objects, but the logic of the landscape itself. Ancient river courses, long filled with sediment, may still emerge in geophysical signals beneath the seabed like faint ink upon a submerged map. An ancient river is not an artifact in the familiar sense, yet it is the framework of life. Where there is water, there were roots, stopping places, zones of attraction for human presence. In the same way, geomorphological horizons, traces of former shorelines, layers of coastal sediment may reveal where a shore once lay, where a river met the sea, where marsh or open ground once existed. At times, what remains is not the dwelling, but the geometry that once allowed dwelling to exist. Some sheltered coastal sites, protected surfaces, or places less exposed to erosion than open plains may preserve signs of habitation more clearly than others. Yet from this emerges a quieter truth. The clearer these durable fragments become, the more we realize that what lay closest to life had the least chance to remain. Wood vanishes more quickly than stone. Leather, fibre, bindings, woven objects, wooden boats, light structures, the everyday tools of coastal life, all are highly vulnerable to biological decay, chemical change, sediment disturbance, and the mechanical forces of the sea. A stone well may endure, a peat layer may endure, an ancient river may endure, but the rhythm of life around the well, the hand-tying rope upon the shore, the windbreak of a dwelling, the basket placed beside a path, these may have vanished long ago. What disappears is not only material, it is gesture, labour, small objects, intimate spaces, the immediacy of human presence within a place. Here, the reading of the past must slow. What survives is often the hard, the fragmentary, the indirect stone wells, peat cores, pollen shells, geomorphological surfaces, the filled channels of ancient rivers, sediment horizons. What vanishes is what is closest to human life. Rhythms of activity, soft materials, the microstructure of habitation, the smallest details that lend warmth to a world. Thus, even when a submerged site is found, the full sense of life once lived there may never be recovered. Atlit-Yam reveals wells, structures, burials. Doggerland preserves pollen and peat. The Sunda shelf reveals ancient rivers. Each case opens a fragment of a lost landscape, yet also exposes the vast distance between reconstructed terrain and the life that once moved across it. The sea, in the end, does not only swallow land, it swallows detail, and it is detail that makes a world human. Not only through coastline or river does a place become home, but through voices at the well, hands upon rope, a wooden boat drawn ashore at dusk, a woven mat beside the fire, hundreds of gestures never made of stone. When these are lost, what disappears is not only evidence, but the tactile substance of history, the softer part of the past, the part closest to us, the part least likely to endure across millennia. The deepest paradox of underwater archaeology lies not in how much has yet to be found, but in how, even when something is found, we touch only the harder fragments of a once living world, A stone well may survive, but the descent toward it does not. A peat core may survive, but the air of a day lived among marshes does not. An ancient river may appear in signals beneath the sea, yet all the stopping places along its course may be gone entirely. The more we understand this, the more humility the past demands of us. For in telling of a submerged world, we're not only recounting what remains, but listening to the silence of what will never return. When one has travelled far enough beyond the vanished shores, across plains now resting beneath the water, through places that were once paths for man and beast, and have since fallen silent as seabed, perhaps the task is no longer to press deeper into the dark, but to slow, to turn back over the whole of that journey, and to ask a far more difficult question among all that has been passed through. What truly stands firm? What has only begun to appear as possibility? What belongs to evidence? And what still lies within the empty space that human imagination is ever eager to fill? From the end of the Pleistocene into the opening of the Holocene, and onward into the earliest coastal settlements of the Neolithic, the world was reshaped by rising waters, not in one place but across the scale of the planet, to such an extent that countless ancient shorelines, countless lands once habitable, traversable, capable of sheltering the first communities, no longer stand exposed. The Sunda Shelf, Doggerland, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, Atlit-Yam, Beringia, the Pacific coastal stretch. These are no longer scattered names, but gather into a single question, one both humble and vast if the sea has covered so many of the key landscapes of human prehistory. Then is the picture we now hold in hand merely the remnant of a far larger story? It is here that intellectual honesty must outweigh the allure of every hypothesis. To pass over drowned lands is not to have reached an Atlantis. To see gaps in the archaeological record is not to be granted the right to fill them with a mythical empire. What must be held onto now is not the thrill of imagined discovery, but the ability to distinguish, with precision, where evidence has grown dense, where a hypothesis stands only upon environmental logic, and where the unknown must remain as the unknown. For only by pausing in such a way does the ground beneath one's feet begin to show itself more clearly. There are things that are now reasonably certain. Post-glacial sea levels rose dramatically after the last glacial maximum, and over many millennia submerged vast coastal regions that had once been living land, before the sea approached its modern level around 7,000 years ago. Most ancient shorelines, and much of the coastal hinterland behind them, had already disappeared beneath the water. This is no longer a vague imagining, but a major geological fact of the Earth's recent history. There are also places that show human life truly existed in regions now submerged, not in the sense of speculation, but in the form of settlement traces clearly identified. Atlit-Yam stands as one of the firmest anchors of this entire account, with its dwelling structures, stone wells, architecture, and even burials, as though a village had been preserved in water after the land itself had vanished. Doggerland offers a different kind of strength, where the ancient landscape has been systematically reconstructed, from topography to river systems, shorelines, vegetation, fauna, and signs of human occupation. As these fragments of data come together, what was once seen as empty sea begins to reveal itself as a land that once held life. From this follows a consequence that is difficult to avoid. The archaeological record upon which we rely is skewed, not because prehistoric people lived only upon the remaining land, but because that remaining land is simply what has stayed above water. The shifts in sea level from the late Pleistocene into the early Holocene did not merely submerge landscapes, they blurred, damaged, and obscured layers of traces that might once have told a different story of the relationship between humans and the coast, between what is reasonably certain and any broader conclusion. There remains a distance. It is precisely within that distance that one must move most slowly. Doggerland stands as perhaps the most persuasive example that a post-glacial inhabited land once truly existed where there is now sea. There, the landscape is not imagined but reconstructed with increasing detail through layers of interdisciplinary data. The Black Sea presents a different case. It is compelling, dramatic, rich in its suggestion of a great flood memory, yet debate remains deep, from the rate of water inflow to the scale of inundation and the basin's original state. It is a place where the pull of hypothesis exceeds the firmness of conclusion. The Persian Gulf Oasis occupies yet another position. The idea of a refugium within the Gulf when sea levels were lower rests upon strong environmental logic. For if that region was once fertile lowland with fresh water and favourable conditions, then human use of it becomes difficult to dismiss. Even so, it remains closer to a powerful hypothesis than to a closed conclusion. Atlit-Yam, by contrast, is direct evidence, where the story of submerged habitation meets the firmest ground of archaeology. The Sunda shelf opens another kind of reflection, for there the geographical loss is immense, the paleo-landscape logic strong, yet the direct record of habitation beneath the seabed remains far more fragmentary than in certain other cases. Beringia and the Pacific coastal corridor hold special importance for early migrations, but because the relevant shorelines are now submerged, archaeology there becomes so difficult that the earliest traces always hover at the edge between what may have been and what is difficult to prove. When each piece is restored to its proper scale, the question is no longer whether secrets lie beneath the water. It becomes how far we are permitted to go from what we truly know. The boundary that must be held is clear. One cannot leap from the proposition that some inhabited landscapes were submerged to the claim that a global super-civilization once lay beneath the sea. One cannot turn archaeological gaps into evidence for social structures we have no means to confirm. The population sizes of these drowned regions, the complexity of their coastal communities, the depth of early maritime or trade networks, the true role of each submerged landscape in the course of civilization, all remain open doors, not yet measured rooms. Yet the mystery does not weaken when we refuse to go too far. On the contrary, such restraint makes it more credible. For a mystery kept to its proper scale is always deeper than a myth inflated beyond measure. A darkness named as darkness invites more reflection than one too quickly filled with easy assertions. Perhaps the true climax of this journey lies elsewhere, quieter, yet more deeply unsettling. What if beneath the sea there is no golden city, no vast sunken empire of popular imagination? What if what was lost were countless smaller worlds, fishing villages, estuarine communities, groups living by both fishing and gathering, by cultivation and seasonal movement, early maritime corridors, migration routes along the water's edge, societies not monumental yet real enough to live, long enough to gather knowledge, important enough that when they vanished, they carried with them a portion of the very beginning of history beyond our sight. That question may be harder to dismiss than any legend. For if what sank was not a super civilization, but many small worlds once existing between fresh and salt water, between river mouth and open sea, between collective memory and daily life, then what shifts may not be the number of stories we tell, but the very way we define where human history begins. That first shoreline now appears in an entirely different light, no longer a quiet edge of water to be glanced at and left behind, but a boundary erased again and again by time, a place that once held dry sand, shallow water, footprints, small fires burning in the salted wind, before quietly retreating beneath the sea as the post-glacial world reshaped itself. Within that ancient layer of time, prehistoric coasts sank one by one as ice melted and waters rose, while in the present, modern humanity stands upon another edge, watching the curve of sea level through satellites, gauges, and climate models, recognizing that global mean sea level has risen roughly 8 to 9 inches since the late 19th century, with the year 2023 marking the highest level in the satellite record that began in 1993. And so the shoreline at this ending is no longer a single place. It is a lost coastal village, a delta plain blurred beneath sediment and salt water, a fishing ground no longer exposed, an ancient river sleeping beneath layers of deposit, a landscape where people once lived, moved, buried their dead, remembered and forgot, after all the lands traversed, from southern shelves to northern drowned plains, from submerged villages to ancient corridors linking man and animal. That shoreline becomes the representative of countless small worlds erased from the surface map. Before sea level stabilized around 7,000 years ago, most ancient coasts and their habitable hinterlands emerged and sank many times. The opening image returns, now bearing the full weight of what water can conceal. From this, a simple yet profound idea emerges. Before the flood was not a single era, not a unified world covered by one story, but countless small worlds, very small, differing in terrain, in rhythm of life, in the manner of their disappearance. Some were low, fertile deltas. Some were stretches of coast long enough to be walked by daylight and tide. Some were small villages with stone wells. Some were river banks where rafts drifted slowly with the current. Some were peatlands preserving the faint shadow of trees, pollen, and vanished flows. Not every drowned place was a centre of civilization, nor need it be. It is enough to understand that there were many places sufficient for human life, sufficient for memory to form, sufficient for stories to begin, and then vanish before anyone could record them. A person rowing along an ancient river, a person digging a well in a coastal village, a person lighting a fire upon low ground as the wind shifts, a person burying the dead at the water's edge where the soil remained dry enough to hold ritual, a person walking along a stretch of sand unaware that after millennia it would lie beneath meters of salt water. These images do not stand outside evidence. They emerge from the very traces submerged landscapes leave behind, from stone wells, ancient rivers, peat deposits, paleo channels and paleo estuaries, from coastal routes slowly overtaken by post-glacial waters. The past beneath the sea is not a single lost empire. It is many small lives, severed from surface memory piece by piece, shore by shore, current by current. From that past, a subtle symmetry opens with the present. Prehistoric people had no satellites, no altimetry, no trend graphs, no digital maps. They had only a changing shoreline before their eyes, water advancing little by little across generations, familiar paths growing damp, hunting grounds shifting, estuaries widening, once stable ground becoming uncertain. Today, modern humanity observes the same process through increasingly precise measurements, seeing that sea level is not only rising but accelerating from about 1.4 millimeters per year through much of the 20th century to around 3.6 millimeters per year between 2006 and 2015, with strong evidence this trend will continue through the present century. The reflection lies not in one knowing how to measure and the other not, but in this we can now see the curve of change, while prehistoric people could only live through it. The locations traced throughout this account, from vast drowned lands to smaller habitation spaces, from coastal routes to estuaries and ancient basins, begin to lie upon a single plane of thought. The question is no longer only about a few archaeological sites beneath the water, but about the possibility that the earliest chapters of human history unfolded in places no longer exposed. In that light, the ocean ceases to be merely a geographic environment. It becomes a vast archive, incomplete, difficult to read, fragmented, yet still perhaps holding the first edges of human memory. The work of tracing paleo landscapes today is an effort to read again spaces where people once lived, moved, laboured, remained long enough for culture to take root before being covered by water. From here, the question of the entire narrative steps back once more, beyond individual shorelines, beyond isolated discoveries, beyond local sediment layers, towards something deeper if the terrestrial archaeological record has been skewed by sea level change. Then perhaps our sense of where history begins stands upon an incomplete foundation. We tend to imagine origins as something visible upon intact land, a valley, a highland, a settlement that can be seen and excavated. But what if a crucial part of early gathering, early communication networks, the first rhythms of coming and going, unfolded along low coastal margins that were favourable for life, yet most vulnerable to rising seas? This question does not deny what is known on land. It only reminds that what is known may not be the whole. Thus, at this ending, the most memorable figures are not kings, nor named civilizations, but unnamed individuals. A person rowing, a person digging a well, a person tending a fire, a person walking along the low edge of water in a shifting wind, a person burying the dead upon land that would one day become seabed. They bring the entire academic argument close, human, for what is being spoken of is not only stratigraphy, sea level, or sediment cores, but lives once lived upon vanished landscapes. Modern paleo landscape surveys, from geophysics to coring to modelling, do not yield a complete story at once. They reveal fragments, yet each fragment holds the power of connection, as though the past continues to disclose itself, slowly, through its own dim waters. Thus the highest point of this ending lies not in a final discovery, nor in a definitive claim. It lies in a possibility kept open. If the first chapters of history truly lie beneath the water, then what we have lost may not be merely a few archaeological sites, but our very sense of where civilization began, when, and in what form. There is sufficient ground to say that rising seas have erased from the surface record many key landscapes of human prehistory, but there is not enough to replace all other accounts with a single complete one. It is this incompleteness that gives the question its endurance. It keeps the narrative from slipping into overstatement, from falling into conspiracy, from turning the ocean into a vault for every secret, leaving instead a slow and deep resonance that beneath those waters may lie the opening of the human story, not the whole, but perhaps the beginning. Lost beneath the sea thus belongs equally to past and present, to memory and geography, to what sank long ago and to what continues to change within the most precisely measured age humanity has ever known. And if what sleeps beneath the water is not only stone, former shores, and sediment, but the earliest edges of human memory itself, then perhaps all we have touched so far is only the outer rim of a story far deeper still.